With over 1 billion worshippers, the Roman Catholic Church is the second largest religion in the world. With its headquarters, the Vatican in Rome, it's one of the oldest and most secret institutions, which makes it a hotbed for conspiracy theories.
It has money, it has power, and it also stands as its own country. That's what makes it unique from any other religion.
In this episode of Conspiracy, we examine the claims of shocking scandals and brutal murders surrounding the Roman Catholic Church. Was the Church guilty of killing its own Pope, John Paul I?
The Vatican is the easiest place in the world to commit murder.
Was the Vatican in league with the Americans to help war criminals guilty of genocide escape justice?
The Vatican has sinned, and I think the souls of the victims deserve justice.
And was the Vatican involved with the murder of the man known as God's banker?
It was a very good business, his death.
The Catholic Church has 2,000 years of scandalous history and intrigue hidden within its walls. History and intrigue which have led to the conspiracy theories we examine here. And because the Vatican is a sovereign country, it can police itself, and some claim choose to hide its sins.
When you have God on your side and you're also put in a position of wealth and power and leadership, then often you can be corrupted and anything but holy.
For many, the most damning claim of the Vatican's moral corruption started during the Second World War. On the 6th of April 1941, Adolf Hitler ordered Führer Directive number 25, the invasion of Yugoslavia. After a blitzkrieg lasting just 11 days, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia no longer existed. Instead, Germany installed puppet governments across Europe, including one that ruled over most of what we now know as Croatia. In charge of this new state was an extreme fascist group known as the Ustasha. They were perhaps the most vicious fascists of them all, according to Professor John Pollard of Cambridge University.
What is interesting is that even the Nazis, even the SS, were sometimes shocked by the brutality of the Ustasha.
The Ustasha's leader was ruthless Catholic Ante Pavelic, who for 12 years operated a lethal combination of fascist ideology and devout Catholicism, resulting in mass genocide aimed at cleansing Croatia of all but Roman Catholics, even massacring the Christian Serbs.
As many as 500,000 Jews, Serbs, and Gypsies were murdered at the hands of the Ustasha.
The Ustasha fell in 1945 when the German army collapsed. But the Catholic Church protected their own. While other fascists were being brought to trial for their war crimes, Ante Pavelic and the other leaders of this murderous regime miraculously disappeared from the country. And many believe the Vatican and the White House helped them escape. At the end of the Second World War, the communists were sweeping across Eastern Europe, arresting Nazi and Ustasha troops. The Ustasha knew as fascists and Catholics, if they fell into Russian hands, there would only be one ending: death. Lawyer Jonathan Levy has spent much of his career chasing compensation for victims of Nazi war crimes and tracked Pavlic's escape to the West.
There was this mass of Ustasha's foot soldiers and supporters literally trying to leave the country through the mountain passes into Austria, into friendly territory. And in that mass of people was a convoy of Pavelic, his Minister of the Interior, Tukovic, the Vice President of Croatia, leaders of some of the elite units.
With the blood of 500,000 on their hands, many claim there was only one place of safety: the heart of the Catholic Church.
Pavelic and his group moved down to Rome, where safe houses had been prepared for him.
In Rome, the Allies were ready to capture any escaping fascists. Special Agent William Gowan had been charged with arresting them on behalf of the US Army.
Ante Pavelic was in Rome in hiding with other associates, and some people thought he was in San Girolamo, which was the Croatian Pontifical College in the center of Rome.
Gowan claims Pavelic hid among thousands of Roman Catholic refugees headed straight for this Vatican-backed Croatian college in the heart of Rome.
If you were a Croatian, everybody knew that you had to go to the Croatian college to register as a Croatian refugee to get identity documents, to get a few free meals. Now, the identity document was terribly important.
Near the top of the Allies' arrest list, Pavelic needed a new identity fast, and that's what Gowan claims the priests of the college provided.
They said, well, we'll tell you what we do. We'll baptize you here and give you a baptismal certificate, which will be a valid identity document.
Providing Ante Pavelic with a baptismal certificate under a new name would allow him to get a new passport and make his escape out of Europe. But why would priests help a war criminal whose regime Pollard claims was more brutal than even the Nazis?
In this kind of situation, my enemy's enemy is my friend. For Catholics, particularly for Croatian Catholics, the communists were the bad guys.
By the end of the war, the communists were busy destroying the power of the church across much of Eastern Europe. It's claimed the Vatican was hoping Catholics, led by men of faith like Pavelic, would be able to fight back. Gowan claims that Pavelic was indeed in Rome and that he was onto him. But just before he could arrest him, Gowan was stopped in his tracks by a call from his superiors.
We'd spent months hunting this man. We finally decided we could arrest him. We announced that, and we got a telephone call saying you cannot arrest, you will not arrest Ante Pavelic. That stunned us.
Pavelic made his escape to South America, but it would take another 40 years until Gowan discovered why he was ordered not to arrest Pavelic. And when he did, the trail led not just to the Vatican, but directly to the White House too. At the end of the Second World War, genocidal Croatian fascist Ante Pavelic was a wanted war criminal. But it's claimed that his arrest by the Allied forces had been suddenly blocked, and he remained protected by the Catholic Church until he disappeared.
The Vatican, to use their own terminology, has sinned, and I think the souls of the victims deserve justice.
And it was not just the Vatican sinning. Documents released in 1983 revealed that Father Krunoslav Draganovic, the head of the Croatian college, where Pavelic was said to be hiding, made a deal with US intelligence to take fascists from Europe to the safety of South America.
The contract was signed, and it provided for Draganovic to accept from the Americans these people for export from Italy.
the USA had decided, with the help of the Church, to save fascist war criminals from justice in order that they'd help in the fight against the new enemy, communism. And conspiracists are convinced that the whole of the Vatican, not just a rogue priest, was behind this.
Draganovich was not a rogue priest. He was part of the whole system there. And they were proud of it. You can imagine. This is unbelievable. It is unbelievable.
I cannot believe that some people in the Vatican didn't know about it, in particular Monsignor Montini.
Monsignor Montini was the Pope's secretary. If John Pollard is right, then knowledge of the conspiracy goes right to the very center of the Vatican, as Montini was himself elected Pope in 1963. If the Vatican and the US government really had hoped that Pavelić would lead the fight against communism in Croatia, then they were disappointed. Instead, he lived out the rest of his life in Argentina and Spain, where he died in 1959. But the Church's war on communism continued, and some say it almost cost a pope his life. In 1978, the Roman Catholic Church took the radical step of electing a non-Italian pope. He came from communist Poland.
He was the first non-Italian for over 400 years, which is a big issue.
Visiting dozens of countries, this charismatic young pope, John Paul II, and his famous Pope-mobile became a worldwide superstar. Then, on the 13th of May, 1981, gunshots rang out in St. Peter's Square. And 3 bullets slammed into his body, critically wounding him. But was he the victim of a lone, crazed gunman? Or, as writer and security expert Nigel West believes, the victim of a sophisticated KGB plot to kill him because he was seen as a threat to the Soviet Union?
Unless John Paul II was neutralized permanently, he was undermining the whole of the communist stranglehold.
Cardinal Wojtyła, as Pope John Paul was then known, was born in Poland and rose to be Archbishop of Krakow. Right from the start, John Paul wanted to be seen as one of the people, rather than a distant godlike figurehead.
It is true. John Paul II, he loves you.
He had this charisma that appealed to the young. He had a certain ease with which he presented himself, almost a familiarity, which was relatively new, I think.
In his first 4 years as Pope, John Paul II reinvigorated the Roman Catholic Church. But on the 13th of May 1981, he almost met his maker. Journalist Andrea Purgatori reported on the crime from the Vatican.
It was a normal day for him. He was meeting the people, stopping, shaking hands.
20,000 Catholics had gathered inside the Vatican just to catch a glimpse of their beloved Pope. But there was one man in the crowd with a darker motive.
He just took his gun over the heads of the people. The Pope was 2, 3, 4 meters, no more, close to him. He shot him.
Shot 3 times in the stomach, arm, and hand, Pope John Paul II fell into the arms of his secretary and was rushed to hospital.
The wound of the Pope was very deep and very dangerous. Every minute, every second was important.
The whole of Rome shut down, and the Catholic faith went into mourning.
This Pope was so young and so close to the people that for the Romans it was like if there was a friend who was wounded.
Deeply shocking for many people, Roman Catholics and of all other faiths.
The Pope survived, and the gunman, Ali Agca, a Turkish citizen with extreme right-wing views, was arrested attempting to flee the scene.
Well, he obviously was guilty. That is very clear.
Ali Agca was convicted and sent to jail for life for attempting to assassinate the Pope. He was the only man prosecuted for this crime, but many questioned his motives from the very beginning.
Ali Agca was well known to the Turkish intelligence authorities because he was a fugitive from justice.
Ali Agca claimed to have been hired by a terrorist group and trained to kill to order in 1978.
He was a murderer. He'd been convicted of killing an editor in Turkey. He had escaped from prison, and he was a very dangerous hitman, a hired gun.
But if Ali Agca was a hired gun, he wasn't saying who paid him.
His behavior, his various statements, many of them contradictory, created so much dust that they made it rather difficult to arrive at a very clear conclusion about who had organized it.
The police could not tell if Ali Agca was playing a very clever game designed to confuse them, or if he was mentally unstable.
I think Agca is perfectly into the role of an actor who's performing. It's part of his public image. Who knows what's behind?
According to Nigel West, when the police reconstructed Ali Agca's movements before the shooting, they revealed that far from being a lone madman, he had the backing of a well-funded group.
The evidence that Ali Agca did not work alone is contained, first of all, in his passport. The passport is absolute proof of his movements around Western Europe at a time when he didn't have any source of money. He was traveling to Sicily, Mallorca, Perugia.
Papers found on Ali Agca went further to show where he'd found the money to travel around Europe.
The contents of his pockets disclosed local telephone numbers which turned out to be owned by 3 different Bulgarians in Rome.
The numbers were for the offices of the Bulgarian embassy and the Bulgarian airline. And the most revealing number allegedly went straight to the heart of the Bulgarian government.
One particular Bulgarian who'd been identified by the Italian authorities as the local representative in Rome of the DS, that's the Foreign Intelligence Service for Bulgaria.
But why Bulgaria? A communist satellite country in Eastern Europe with no formal links to the Vatican. This puzzles Cambridge University professor of history, John Pollard.
I can't see any particular reason why the Bulgarians would have wanted by themselves to attack the Pope. It just doesn't, they had no particular interest or investment in such a thing.
According to journalist Andrea Purgatori, the Bulgarian secret services operated as a hired gun for the KGB, carrying out operations on behalf of the Soviet Union at arm's length.
Historically, the Bulgarian Secret Service has always been the armed arm of the KGB. They were entitled to kill all the dissidents around Europe. In Great Britain, they did it in France, they did it in many countries.
Why would the Soviet Union want to kill such a high-profile religious leader? The theory is that they feared Polish-born Pope John Paul II would provoke a revolution in Poland that would bring down the whole Eastern Bloc.
The Poles had suffered repression during the Second World War. They then exchanged domination by the Nazis for domination by Moscow. Food was scarce, pay was limited, life was extremely difficult. There was no hope for the future.
John Paul II had lived most of his adult life under a communist regime that suppressed his religion, and he became an outspoken critic of communist atheism.
John Paul II saw the communists as a greater threat to civilization and to Christianity than the Nazis.
His ordination as Pope came around the same time as his native Poland was beginning to demand political change through a new Catholic Union movement called Solidarity.
Solidarity stood out against repression and intimidation, everything that the communists espoused.
The Pope was not just a figurehead for Solidarity.
He threatened that in the event of a Soviet invasion, he would get on the first plane to Warsaw and he would be in the front line of resisting a Soviet occupation.
By 1981, demonstrations were breaking out across Poland, with 13 million people taking part in a national strike. And it seemed that Poland was on the verge of the civil war that the Soviets had been fearing.
Poland represented the first domino, and that if you pulled Poland out of the Warsaw Pact, then the whole of the rest of the edifice would collapse.
With their empire on the brink of collapse, Nigel West believes the Soviet Union had to act. And in London, a plan was hatched.
We know from Oleg Gordievsky, who was the resident designate for the KGB in the London embassy, that a questionnaire had been circulated by the chief of the first chief directorate, Vladimir Khrushchev, inviting senior management to make suggestions about how the Solidarity organization could be penetrated and how John Paul II could be neutralized.
According to Nigel West, the KGB's head spy in London had asked for ways to kill the Pope.
He believed, rightly so, that the whole of the communist grasp on Central and Eastern Europe was in jeopardy, and neutralizing John Paul II would be one way of saving an entire Soviet history and way of life.
So was the lone gunman who almost killed John Paul II really a fall guy for a desperate KGB plot to prevent the Soviet Union being destroyed by a charismatic Pope? Professor John Pollard does not think so.
To be convinced that it was a Kremlin KGB plot, I would need to see the testimony of someone who was pretty close to the Kremlin. It's 34 years, and we still haven't had anything approaching that kind of testimony, that kind of documentation.
Thanks in part to Pope John Paul II and the power of the Vatican, the Soviet Union and the states that depended on it collapsed in 1989. But at the same time as it was playing a part in liberating millions, was it also engaged in murder? In the early 1980s, one name was synonymous with corporate corruption on a global scale: Roberto Calvi. As one of Italy's top bankers, it's claimed he was profiting from vast sums of money laundered by the mafia and the Vatican. A plot that some say led to his death in London, and a murder inquiry which is still open today.
Somebody decided that this man was too dangerous to continue living.
Calvi was nicknamed God's banker because his bank was backed by the Vatican. But could the Vatican be behind his murder and one of the biggest banking frauds of the 20th century?
Calvi's wife was saying from day one very publicly that she thought the Vatican had had him killed.
At 7:30 on a Friday morning in June, a commuter crossing London's Blackfriars Bridge made a grim discovery.
Calvi was found on the morning of the 18th of June, 1982, hanging from scaffolding underneath the bridge.
Days before, Italy's biggest private bank, the Banco Ambrosiano, had declared a £1.5 billion gap in its funds, and its head, Roberto Calvi, was facing a jail sentence for illegally funneling £30 million out of Italy. Suicide seemed a logical conclusion, but not everyone agreed.
The only people that I know who believed it was a suicide were the City of London police.
Chief among the doubters was Roberto Calvi's own son, who hired a private investigator, Jeff Katz, to look into his father's death.
I was quite skeptical about the idea of suicide from the beginning for a variety of reasons. He was a 62-year-old man. He was not used to walking around odd bits of London. And to then, in the middle of the night, climb over a parapet, down a ladder, across to some scaffolding, and then hang himself with some rope that was conveniently found on the scaffolding seemed improbable to me.
Investigative author Gerald Posner believes Calvi's death was no accident, but the direct result of his close involvement with Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican's own bank.
He was a rough and tough 6 foot 4 inch, almost 6 foot 5 inch Chicagoan, boisterous, outgoing.
Marcinkus was a charming man, a smart man, a man ready to do everything to increase his power into the Vatican.
Hailing from Al Capone's hometown of Cicero, Illinois, it's claimed Marcinkus had more in common with Al Capone than this. It's also claimed he had strong links to the mafia.
The mafia and Marcinkus were very well connected.
As the head of the Vatican Bank, Marcinkus was running the only unregulated bank in the world.
It takes money in, and then it invests that money, makes money on it, and keeps it all secret. Really operates almost like an offshore bank in the heart of Rome. It's a bank like no other in the world.
Perfect, many claim, for Marcinkus to hide mafia money because it operated beyond the reach of the Italian or any other government.
So all you need to do if you're the mafia or you're an Italian looking to avoid taxes is get your money physically into the Vatican. You can drive a truck with 10 million pounds in it. It'll go straight into the Vatican, and once it does, it disappears. No Italian tax investigator, no drug investigator, nobody from the DEA or the FBI can ever see it.
But there was a problem. Marcinkus may have been powerful within the Vatican, but he had zero experience of running a bank.
He's got no banking experience at all. He knows nothing about finances. Nothing more than the multiplication tables. Becomes the head of the Vatican Bank. Why? Because the Pope liked him.
And that's where many believe Roberto Calvi came in. The theory is that Marcinkus needed experienced banker Calvi to siphon mafia money from the Vatican Bank into a network of global companies away from prying eyes. That money would then be clean of mafia associations.
The Vatican Bank gets a percentage for doing that. For Marcinkus, he considered that easy money.
Allegedly, the mafia paid Marcinkus a fee to clean their money when it passed through the Vatican Bank and out to Calvi's global companies.
As far as Marcinkus was concerned, he was making about $100,000 a year for the Vatican Bank based upon these tens of millions of dollars of transfers, and he thought that was the safest $100,000 he could ever make.
By 1978, Calvi's dealings had helped transform the Vatican Bank into a financial powerhouse, turning over hundreds of millions each year. But the Bank of Italy got wind of Calvi's illegal money transfers from the Banco Ambrosiano and began an investigation.
Calvi's clearly desperate. He's tried for export control violations and he's convicted, so it's unraveling fast.
It took investigators 3 years to unpick Calvi's global network. And in 1981, Calvi was given a suspended jail sentence of 4 years and fined £14 million for illegally exporting money from Italy. And Calvi was determined he wouldn't take sole responsibility. He frantically wrote a personal letter to Pope John Paul II, stating that the bank's collapse would
provoke a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, in which the Church will suffer the greatest damage.
For some, this letter was seen as a threat, which the Vatican would not stand for. For others, a desperate plea for mercy, as they claim people connected with the case were being picked off and killed, one by mafia hitmen.
The first magistrate who was investigating on the Banco Ambrosiano, he was killed. Then the number 2 of the Banco Ambrosiano, the right arm of Calvi, was wounded in an attempt assassination in Milano. And then the secretary of Calvi committed suicide. I mean, it's a story of death.
Only days before he was due to go to prison, Calvi fled Italy under a false name.
Someone told him, okay, we will save you. You can go to London. We will protect you in London. In that moment, he was really weaker than ever in the hands of the people of the organized crime.
Many people believe if Calvi was running with the mafia's help, he was sealing his own death warrant. He knew too much and needed to be silenced. Through investigation and eyewitness interviews, Jeff Katz discovered 2 days after his arrival in London, Calvi left his apartment with 2 Italians.
He got onto a boat, was taken down the river to what he probably thought was a rendezvous with people who were going to help him. Was strangled probably somewhere not far from Blackfriars Bridge, and then placed on the scaffolding.
If this was murder, not suicide, then why pick such a public place? This wasn't the mafia's style.
You're putting him under a bridge in London as though he's hanged himself. You're sending a message out in a lot of ways that this is a death we want everyone to take notice of. So it's not just running by in a motor scooter and shooting somebody in the head the way that the mafia often kills prosecutors in Italy.
The claim is that the choice of Blackfriars Bridge was no accident, as the Black Friars are the nickname of Italy's most secretive Freemasons' lodge.
It was a secret lodge into which you could find almost all the most important and influential people in Italy, in politics, in finance, in the police, and of course they were members of the Vatican.
Perhaps the final evidence of a conspiracy is that, according to some, the biggest financial beneficiary of Calvi's death was said to be Archbishop Marcinkus's Vatican Bank.
When Calvi died and the money disappeared, it was wonderful for the Vatican Bank. It was a very good business, his death.
For years, the official line remained that Calvi committed suicide. But in 2003, the City of London Police reopened the case as a murder inquiry.
It was very difficult for the City of London Police to maintain the idea that it had been a suicide. They accepted that it was a homicide. Mind you, that was some 24, 25 years after the event.
12 years later, no one has been convicted. And if, as some believe, the Vatican killed a Catholic banker, is it also capable of murdering a pope? On the 26th of August, 1978, new Pope John Paul I was elected to rule over 500 million Catholics.
He was a darling man, and he had the warmest, sweetest smile I've ever seen on a human being.
Albino Luciani was nicknamed the Smiling Pope, and some believe he was determined to bring the Church into the modern world, especially when it came to the Vatican's greatest taboo, birth control.
From the very beginning, Luciani always realized that something had to be done to stop the population explosion.
Some claim, against 2,000 years of preaching, John Paul was prepared to look at the use of the pill for birth control. But before he could make any changes, 33 days into his new role, he was found dead.
It's a real tragedy. He had so much to offer, so much to give.
Officially, it was said to be a heart attack. But there are many who claim he was murdered by his fellow priests, and that the Vatican got away with it.
The Vatican is the easiest place in the world to commit murder.
"15 years before John Paul became Pope, his predecessor, Paul VI, was known for his strong conservative views. As a Vatican historian and commentator, William Doino has studied his strong opposition to any form of birth control.
Pope Paul VI comes out with his papal encyclical in 1968, Humanae Vitae, in which he declares and reaffirms that we cannot change the Church teaching. These are foundational truths, immutable truths of the will of God, and we will stand by this Church teaching.
Historian and writer John Julius Norwich believes social changes from the 1960s and 70s were forcing the Church to consider more liberal views, which included electing Albino Luciani the Smiling Pope.
The old guard, who were determined to stick to the old ideas, were terrified. This would have been a major revolution in the Vatican.
Norwich claims the new Pope's views were very different to the Vatican's traditions.
He saw that the world's population was increasing by 500,000 a day or something, and realized that this couldn't go on. The Catholic Church, they just didn't see what was happening. They just didn't see the danger.
But not only that, children were dying at an alarming rate.
Just after he became Pope, he was having a conversation with Cardinal Vio, who was the Secretary of State. He said, "Look, we've been talking about contraception for the last 45 minutes. During that time, 250,000 children have died of malnutrition."
Norwich believes Luciani's solution to this global crisis was to consider the new miracle birth control pill, which had recently become available worldwide.
Now, when the pill comes into existence, some theologians argued or thought that because it worked supposedly with the natural rhythms of human beings, this could perhaps be reconciled with the Church teaching.
If the Pope wanted to bring birth control into the Catholic faith to prevent millions dying of hunger in an overpopulated world, many in the Church would see this as sacrilege. But, according to John Julius Norwich, the Pope was determined.
He made no secret of the fact, and he very quickly made a great many enemies who not so much hated him, but were scared stiff of him because he was going to blow this whole thing open. This is why so many people had a motive to get rid of this man, and quick.
How far were these enemies within the Vatican willing to go to stop the Pope? Just 33 days into his papacy, Pope John Paul I was found dead in his bed. The Vatican said that he had suffered a heart attack.
People just could not believe that a man as gifted and as holy and as wonderful as Pope John Paul I could have or should have suddenly died like that. There must have been some foul play involved.
Norwich's theory is that within the secretive and closed-off environment of the Vatican, the Pope was killed quietly in his sleep.
He would have to have been murdered by poison. Somebody would have had to have crept up and entered his room in the middle of the night. There's a considerable risk of waking him up and dropping this pill or liquid or whatever it was into his water glass.
For many who believe foul play, the chief suspect is Cardinal Vio, who was the only man who could cover up the evidence.
There was a Cardinal, Vio, who was the Cardinal Secretary of State. They're responsible for removing all the things from the Pope's room, and what should have been done much more methodically and carefully were rushed, and a lot of people blame Vio for this.
He was the one who started telling all these lies about the conditions in which the Pope had been found. He probably is the one who very, very quickly removed the water glass from the side of his bed.
According to Norwich, this was the key piece of evidence, and it had been removed without trace.
I think they did rather a good job. I mean, they got rid of the whole lot within hours. Destruction of evidence. I mean, there's no other explanation for it.
The claim by some of those who believe John Paul's death was not natural is that Vatican officials deliberately avoided contacting Luciani's own doctor.
They didn't want the truth to come out. They didn't want anybody to say that he was perfectly well, which is what his own doctor would have said.
With no obvious cause of death, William Doino alleges there were calls from within the Vatican for an autopsy, as required by Italian law for all deaths of this nature.
There were cardinals at the time that were saying, we must have an autopsy on the Pope.
The Vatican is a city-state within Rome, so it doesn't have to follow any laws other than its own. And that's exactly what it chose to do.
They did not have an autopsy, which I think is a tragedy.
The Vatican is the easiest place in the world to commit murder. There is no police force at all. The Italian police force is only allowed in if it's invited, and it wasn't.
Any physical evidence was supposedly destroyed when the Pope's body was embalmed within a day of his death.
If the Vatican wanted to create the idea of suspicion or of some kind of conspiracy, they did everything toward that end.
And for some, the Vatican's next assertions made it look even more guilty of a cover-up.
There were reports right after he died that he had been found, sitting up pleasantly in bed, smiling and reading the book, The Imitation of Christ. As it turns out, there doesn't seem to be a shred of evidence for this.
The Vatican claimed the Pope's body had been found by his private secretary, Father McGee, while he was sitting in bed. In truth, he was found by a nun.
The way the Vatican responded to it, of course, made it even more suspicious because the Vatican has started contradicting itself. They were caught out again and again and again.
These inconsistencies convinced many that the Vatican were covering up a murder scene.
I think in the Vatican, they're priests, but they're certainly not saints. I don't think they're any better than any of the rest of us, really. In fact, probably rather worse because of this extraordinary artificial atmosphere in which they live.
But for William Doino, the Vatican's mistakes were never a cover for foul play.
You can never absolutely rule out foul play, although I do not believe, I want to make clear, that foul play was involved. I believe he died an innocent natural death. Still, because no one was there and mistaken statements were made by the Vatican at the time, this did fuel and still fuels today a lot of these conspiracy theories and questions.
We may never know the truth behind how Pope John Paul I died, whether God's banker hung himself, or if the Vatican gave safe haven to war criminals. But as long as the Vatican remains as secretive as it is today, there will always be conspiracy theories questioning what really happens in God's name.